Okay, thanks very much, Leah. And pleasure to be with everybody. It's a little bit unusual to do it in this kind of way, but without kind of that visual interaction. But I know everybody is probably very used to what you're doing now. What I want to do is just touch on what I think is an extremely important question, and there is at a number of levels. Can we live forever? Now, that's a pretty easy question to answer, I think, for most people. And I suppose much of it is, at least for most people, is that they don't really spend an awful lot of time thinking about the question, can we live forever, until you start getting middle-aged and above like me. But anyway, the question is definitely maybe, and if there is a positive, and I know that there are some positives with the current COVID situation, in spite of the tragedy that certainly is happening for a number of people, both in terms of health and unfortunately the mortality, but also economically. But I've seen two benefits at least coming out of the sort of crisis that we've gone through or are currently in. And one is, it seems, I've never seen so many families walking down through the bush and up the road, at least around our place. And that's a positive. And the other thing is that it actually helps people, or at least puts people in a position where they are thinking a little bit more about their own mortality, or at least that of their loved ones. So it is an important question, and I want to just take us through a little bit because there is a perspective here which I think is extremely important for us to have as Christians, and what we can actually give to the world. So if we have a look at life expectancy, I mean, it's something that we're all aware of to some extent. But, it's been increasing since at least 1900. And we're up around about 80 years for men, 84 years for women. And that's a pretty good lifespan. Australia is one of the best in the world. And if you have a look at the oldest person who's currently living, this is this lady here, 117 years old, Kane Tanaka from Japan. Looks a little bit different than when she was young, but she looks pretty good, I think. And I don't know whether any of you saw on one of the news feeds earlier this week, but a lady of 113 from Spain, actually, who went through the first Spanish flu. She had this first Spanish flu and recovered from that. And now she's just recovered from COVID-19. And that's at 113, which is quite amazing. So people can live a long time, there's no question. But what we've got to ask ourselves, and a lot of scientists are asking, there's a big field of research at the moment where some of our research is actually linked to this. And I guess for those of you that don't know my background, I lead a fairly active research group in what we call the Australasian Research Institute, attached to our Sydney Adventist Hospital, but also to a couple of our major medical schools. And it's some of our work, while we don't specifically say that we're involved in aging research, we're more interested in degenerative disease and how to affect that, but it certainly has implications for aging. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later on. But if you have a look at this, this trajectory, if you like, of maximum modern human lifespans, we're sitting here at getting up around about the 115 mark. This is this lady, Jeanne Calment from France. She died in 1997. She was 122. I don't have time really to tell you, but there's a fascinating story behind that. In fact, I'll tell you just a little bit, because it may even impact on just the fact that she lived such a long time. When she was in her 80s, she was approached by one of the local barristers, her lawyers, who said, look, I will buy your property for a set sum. I'll give you a set sum every week. And it was quite a good one. So she would get a regular salary. Now, he assumed that because she was in her 80s, that she would be dead by the time she's at least, maybe 10 years. So from his sort of actuarial approach, he's looking at it mathematically and going, well, there's a pretty good chance I'm going to make really good on this. So gave her a handsome sum per week, but expected that within a few years that he would be able to collect on this property that she owned, that she was living in Paris. Well, unfortunately, she turned out to outlive him by many years, and ended up being paid a very handsome sum. She didn't need to worry about her finances, which may have helped to contribute to the fact she lived a long time. But anyway, that's aside. The point being here is that what they've done is push this projection out, and this is from one of the Nature articles, push this projection out and said, well, if we're here in 2000 and if we keep this same kind of growth trajectory, certainly by the year we get to 2300, we're going to be living on average around, or at least our longest lived populations can get out to probably 155. Well, there are some real believers in this one. If information and technology continue to improve exponentially, a scientific revolution will indeed occur. We may then be able to rewrite and upgrade the software of life to avoid death. It's a big claim. If we, and that's published in Rejuvenation Research, if we have a look at Aubrey de Grey, who's in fact inherited quite a lot of his money from his mother and has poured that into a research foundation. And he is a strong advocate. He says, get the word out there, educate people that curing aging is not science fiction. It's science feasible. It's going to happen, and the sooner it happens, the better. Getting the word out is really what it's all about. Now, in my opinion, Aubrey de Grey steps a little bit beyond the science, and unfortunately, in some ways, if he was able to demonstrate that in his own life that the aging trajectory was being slowed down, it might be a little more believable. But in any case, Groucho Marx made what I think is a profound statement: I intend to live forever or die trying. And by God's grace, we cannot just die trying, but we might actually be able to succeed. So what is actually aging? Let me take you through a little bit of science, and some of you may have, if you've heard some of my talks before, you may have heard a little bit of this, but it's a good way to think about the reality of what some of the claims that I've just mentioned are, and are they likely to be true? So if we have a look at aging, and the great way to see aging is particularly what's happening with the skin, and you can see the difference between here and the older self is that the skin doesn't work so well. And there's a reason behind that, because it's actually accumulating damage as you go from, and the skin turns over about every month. And so every month you're ending up with new skin cells. Now, if those skin cells were exactly the same as the previous ones, you would look exactly the same. The tragedy is that we don't, and we know that we can accumulate damage, and we do accumulate damage in those cells, so that the next generation of cells have a little bit more damage than the previous, and it goes on continually. And of course, we know that we can damage the skin a lot faster by just going out into the sun, or smoking, or in fact drinking. And there's you can eat foods that have a lot of what we call advanced glycation end products. You could, develop diabetes. All of those will actually affect the integrity of the skin, or the amount of damage that skin, its underlying tissue, is getting, and therefore cause aging faster. Now, if it's happening to the skin, it's going to be happening to every other tissue and organ, sometimes at different rates. If you wanted to age the liver faster, of course, you drink more alcohol or some other drugs. In fact, you could take a lot of paracetamol and age your liver a lot faster as well. Aging your brain, people will tell you that, yes, you could take alcohol. We know that causes damage and will shrink the brain, etc. But there's a number of ways, and you'll do it to all of those organs. But why are they actually affecting us? So when we think, the body has all of these different fantastic organs which work beautifully, and they're all at the cellular level. We've got the body, and it's made up of organs, it's made up of tissues, and they're made up of cells. And those cells get all of their instructions from the DNA, which sits in the middle. If you damage that DNA, then when it goes to make the next group of cells, and I won't go into stem cells or anything like that, but you've got specialized cells which are really kept in a very pristine condition so that they can make the next generation of cells. But if you damage them and it doesn't get repaired, then unfortunately that next generation of cells which make up the next tissue, which make up the next organs, which ultimately makes the next the body, it will look a little bit different. It works a little bit less effectively than what it did before. This is actually the process of aging. We can accelerate it. We can actually impair some of that acceleration by choices that we make. So accumulation of that cell debris and damage causes that aging. So where do these damaged bits come from? And we talk about them as free radicals, which lots of people would know about. There's another term, reactive oxygen or reactive nitrogen species, or what we call oxidative stress. And just by basically converting the sugars and fats that you ate this morning into energy will produce damage. It produces lots of free radicals. Yep, if you're getting toxic sprays or fumes from cars, or even, as I said, paracetamol is one of the ones from here, these will actually create more free radicals through a particular process that occurs in the liver and elsewhere. The immune system also, when you switch that on, and if it's kept on, everybody's heard of this inflammation being bad for you, inflammation being the foundation for causing things like, well, cardiovascular disease. It can certainly produce it. It can cause problems with the brain, and we know that there's a lot of inflammatory background to the development of degenerative dementias, etc. So you don't want the immune system on for a long time. So you need to switch it on when you need it and switch it off pretty quickly. But a large proportion of the population have their immune system chronically switched on in what we call mostly subclinical, but it can be a problem. And then when the body tries to remove some of the cell debris because it's damaged and turning over, it'll also generate more free radicals. So if you've got lots of damaged products, that can increase more free radicals. We know that the sun, you get that from the UV light. X-rays will do it. I mentioned also some of the chemotherapeutics and chemical pollutants, pesticides, etc. These can all add to that damage. Now, fortunately, the body has a way of being able to protect itself from that damage, and these are our professional antioxidants, glutathione peroxidase and its whole system, superoxide dismutase, catalase. They work in different parts of the body and cell. And the ones that most people know are the vitamins A, C, E, which you get from foods, carotenoids, which you're going to get from all of those red, orange, green type foods, and then the polyphenols, which again, you're getting from whole foods. So you can add a lot to your antioxidants, and all they do is help to mop up or block damage that's caused by these free radicals. So they can actually help to prevent some of the damage that's occurring from just normal living. Some people know about telomeres, so I've mentioned them in here. They're the little bits on the end of chromosomes, which is what the DNA is packaged into, and it actually helps them to stop being damaged. And as you get older with more free radicals, you can actually stop those telomeres from growing. And once they stop, once they get certain length, once they're too short, then the cell itself stops dividing. If it stops dividing, then unfortunately, it goes into a process what we call senescence, which is a cell that doesn't function so well. And we see a lot of that in people as they get older. So you don't want that to happen. You don't want that free radical attack. So when they get too short, as I mentioned, they stop dividing, and then you end up with senescence and aging. Now, I'm moving pretty rapidly through what is relatively complex, but those principles that I've just given are pretty accurate. So the key point here is that the free radicals produce the cumulative tissue damage, particularly to things like DNA, and they accelerate aging. So the higher the rate of the damage, the faster the aging process. So if you want to live forever, you've got to stop the aging process. Isn't that true? Of course it is. If you want to live forever, you've actually got to stop that process of damage. Now, you can't stop living. Clearly, that would be counter to living forever. So you've got to somehow stop the process. How are you going to do that? Well, you could prevent all damage to cells, virtually impossible, or you could perfectly repair all damage to the cells. Now, I'm going to tell you that that's pretty impossible too, but there are some strategies, and there's billions of dollars being poured into it. And in fact, there's industries making billions of dollars out of it. We could replace the cell, and we talk about stem cells, and people are getting different types of stem cell therapies. Some people are getting themselves injected with the blood of young people, which will actually contain some younger cells in there and some younger factors which can help promote things, etc. A dangerous process, and I think there's all sorts of problems, not the least of which might be some ethical issues in there. But it is also impossible for you to change every single cell. Then there's this idea of protect and repair. Now, as people who are actually interested in the regenerative process, and our research is involved in some of this area, we like the idea of protecting and repairing. And we think many lifestyle factors actually play a big role in this, which is why lifestyle plays such a big role. And whether it's from science or whether it's from inspiration, the point is that absolutely right on the money to try and protect and repair. The question is, can you actually do it perfectly? Well, There's a couple of things. So you can reduce the amount of DNA damage. You can prevent telomere shortening by reducing that oxidative stress or increasing. There's an enzyme called telomerase in there. And all of that can happen, and all of that is a great idea. So people have tried to overexpress genes. There's all sorts of things in here with epigenetics. I'm just going to mention this particular area here, and to some extent here is where our research has been focused. And we've made a little contribution. We picked up from a number of people. There's even a website that's quoting our papers as being foundational for some of the products they're developing or selling, actually. But this molecule NAD is extremely important in being able to maintain cell function. And don't go into details, but it just means that we are a little oriented to this area. Reducing free radical attack, well, limiting exposure, and that's what I've mentioned. Lifestyle, what a great way to do it. Increasing antioxidant capacity, and you can do that through the types of things you eat and exercise and all of those type of things. But whatever the method, in order to stop aging, it must be 100% effective in every organ of the tissue of the body. You know, that really, and I'll just be really quite frank here, it is completely beyond our current ability. We will not and cannot do it. And there is no foreseeable way of doing it. And look, I think from probably about the 1950s onwards, certainly post-war, technology has, I think, enjoyed, at least among many people, an incredible faith, where people think that technology is going to be able to save us from all sorts of things. And technology, there are some brilliant technologies out there, and they continue to grow. But if any of you remember the Jetsons, who are flying around in their little, you know, anti-gravity machines and living up in sort of space, there are limitations that we are finding, even in terms of our artificial intelligence, even when it comes to, I think, driverless cars, which are creating a headache for people. I think we will find that there are limitations, and I think we're beginning to appreciate that in our technology broadly. Now, while I'm not saying we've necessarily got to the end of our ability in technology, I think we've got a lot of things we can still develop. I think when it comes to doing something like this, the faith that's being put in the modern science and technology, I think we need to just take a little bit of a realistic look. There is no way in an extremely complex organism like the human, or any other life for that matter, it will be difficult for that to occur, and I certainly can't perceive it. So there's no credible means in science to allow humans to live indefinitely. And I just always like to make a little appeal, given that I'm a researcher which depends on some funding. If anybody wants to give their money away to some of the anti-aging areas, think about us, because at least we'll be honest with you. We won't tell you you'll live forever, but we might be able to do something at least to make you live better. And this is a little example here. Can we live forever? This is a particular gentleman who was particularly enthusiastic about the idea. He named himself FM 2030, and he was born Feridun in Esfandri. But he changed his name to reflect his goal of living to 100. So by 2030, he would have had his 100th birthday. And he also predicted that by 2030, we'll be ageless and everyone will have an excellent chance to live forever. 2030, he said, is a goal, or at least is a dream and a goal. Now, very sadly, he died in 2000, age 69, from pancreatic cancer. There's an awful lot that we don't know, and I think it's dangerous for people to be putting their faith in the technology, certainly that we have, to be able to keep them living forever. I guess one step just past that too is that there is a number of people who have, and you've probably heard of cryopreservation. These are where people are actually getting themselves deep frozen in liquid nitrogen. We use liquid nitrogen in our research lab here, and we have, in fact, you know, we can keep cells living and we bring them up. But even when we try and freeze cells as a monolayer, which means just a single cell, a single layer of cells, we know that we only get between around about 85% will actually survive. Now, that's with a single cell. To try and do that for a whole body, if you try and bring back a whole body, even if only 85% of them was able to come back in good condition, which I'm fairly confident that that would be very difficult to do, then I think that the body itself is going to have sustained so much damage in so many critical areas that that's virtually impossible. So we do have a difficulty, I think, in being able to trust the technology which is currently there to deliver on the claims that at least are put forward for people who are investing in it. But that's their choice. So I would conclude here essentially that immortality is highly unlikely, at least by modern science, and certainly at this stage. But what we can say is that increased longevity is definitely possible. So the upside is that we can get ourselves living longer and healthier. And everybody, at least many people, are aware of the blue zones. The first one coming out by Dan Buettner, a series of articles, at least in National Geographic in 2005. Been a book since written, and then till then, and since then, in 2016, there was sort of an update in terms of a few things. And this was really just a group of people that had been identified around the world. Originally, it was just 4 of them, but they've added Icaria, Greece. They added Nicoya, Costa Rica in there. And so these are just groups of people in the world who are living a very long time. The interesting one is that the only one that's living in a modern Western high-pressured context in an area like Los Angeles is the Loma Linda Adventists, which is outside of Los Angeles, but essentially in a fast-paced world. All of these others are essentially more isolated communities. But in this particular group, they seem to have some secrets which are working really quite effectively. And Dan Buettner says that there are some common things that characterize that longevity. There's psychosocial health, giving some purpose to life, and certainly the religious elements come into that. So religious affiliation, family put ahead of other concerns, people of all ages, socially active and integrated into their communities, not isolating the oldies here and the young ones there, but giving an opportunity for rich exchange. And it's so important for the psychological health of both groups, actually, because it ties young people in to what their heritage is, and it allows the older groups to be able to not only give back, but also gain joy from the activity and the energy of the young. So all help make time for rest, which is really important as well. Vegetable-rich diets, especially legumes, and that was a common theme. Constant moderate physical activity. This wasn't people who were running marathons. This is people that were doing moderate physical activity on a regular basis as a normal part, and they say inseparable part of life. And of course, eliminating smoking. I think most here in Australia would be fairly comfortable, and I don't need to go to details there. So lifestyle choices increase longevity, positive outlook, and we would tie in all of the psychosocial elements there. Particularly, I think foundational is your philosophical beliefs and how you believe what is right and true. And that tells you how, or informs at least, your behavior with others, other human beings, certainly with your creator, and how you should look after the environment. Nutrition, we know that's important. That's the only way you get the raw materials for the body. The physical activity, that stimulates the body. And I need to point out that physical activity doesn't nourish, it only stimulates. Only nutrition actually nourishes, which is why it's actually considered to be a little more foundational than physical activity. There's a gentleman by the name of Anthony Balduzzi, which does a lot of work with what they call the Fit Father Project. And he's got a great quote which says, you can never out-exercise a bad diet. Rest. Once you've got activity going on, there's lots of things we're learning about rest, both in a physical sense, but also in a psychological sense. Really important for the body to get an opportunity to rest. Certainly physically, you can't skimp on sleep. If you do, the body doesn't get the opportunity it needs. There's a process called autophagy. And now there's autophagy and mitophagy, but essentially this is like the garbage removal. And we all know the garbage removal for most of our places happens usually at night, often early in the morning. And the body is actually very similar in that its garbage removal is most effectively occurring overnight. If you inhibit or reduce that sleep, that garbage removal, both in the brain and the rest of the body, doesn't happen. In the brain, you actually get these flushing processes, a little bit like the rinse cycle almost of the washing machine, occurring at night in the brain. So there's a lot of activity going on, but you don't know it, you're resting. So the body's got everything else aside and it can get into that rest and repair. So you really do need sleep. And if you don't get it, then unfortunately, psychologically, you're less well, you're more stressed, etc. And as a quick summary, that all takes you beautifully towards health. And of course, you can go the other way, smoking or other damaging practices, chronic stress for which you're not dealing with, high kilojoule. Now, I just make a quick comment here. Most people think in relation to high kilojoule, they're thinking of particularly high sugars. And it has been known for some time that, the high sugar diets, unfortunately, also stimulate a faster track towards disease. Some recent study that's been going on a little while showing that actually high proteins, and there's arguments at least coming out of some research at University of Sydney, that some high proteins are actually just as bad, if not even worse, than driving degenerative change and reducing longevity, even compared to high sugars. Now, we published a paper very recently where we had characterized over 100 people we had got people who are essentially middle-aged but otherwise well. And we were looking to see whether or not and how different things interacted. And what we noticed was, and this was really, we didn't expect to find it, but indications of high protein intake, both a high protein intake as well as some of the metabolites of protein, particularly urea. But we could see a strong inverse relationship between that and one of the molecules that we know as strongly, and that's the one NAD I alluded to earlier, was inversely related to that molecule. So in other words, the more protein you had, the lower was this longevity molecule. And we found that that was fascinating, so we published that. And we've recently just come through a number of other data, which I won't go into detail, but we're preparing another paper at the moment showing that the fats actually play a significant role in there. And I'll just have a little shout out here. Often, particularly those of us who advocate, and it's very popular now, the vegetarian diets, absolutely fantastic, absolutely excellent. The trouble is that a lot of what happens in vegetarians is that they also will push nuts. Now, nuts are really healthy, but a lot of nuts can actually be pushing in the wrong direction. And we're getting a signal for that in some of the work that we're doing here. And so it's worth just recognizing and I guess it's, I can't help myself, but just giving people a little heads up that, yep, that handful of nuts a day is great. 2 handfuls is probably going to send you a little bit in the other direction. And so be conscious of all the nut products of having too much. Obviously sedentary, and there's lots of reasons why we know that's not good. And look, particularly given people's inability to be able to get outside as much as they would like to, interact with other people, and even just going to work. So there's a lot of, I know from people doing Netflix and sitting at home and spending a lot of time on the couch. Yes, there's the risk of the DVTs, the deep vein thromboses, and there's certainly examples of that, but also just reduced capacity for aerobic capacity, reduced stimulation, and a number of other pathways, including some of the antioxidant ones. So getting a bit more activity is important because it affects you at multiple levels. And of course, these all work together the organs don't work so well. And so unfortunately, illness is where you end up. And sadly, an earlier time in the grave. So another quick thing here is it's not just long life, but a healthy long life. So there was up to a 3-fold greater level of disability in people with 2 or more lifestyle habits that were evident years before that time of death. So it's not just that you're going to die earlier, but you'll actually be sicker for longer before you even die. Whereas the people who actually are living healthily, yes, they're still going to die, but fortunately, they live pretty much healthily right up until right the end. So not only do people with poorer lifestyles experience an accelerated decline towards death, but they also have greater levels of disability for years before death. And that's just a tragedy for a number of people, burden on families, lack of quality of life for the person, and a much higher cost for society's healthcare. So the risk status appeared to be even greater for women. So interesting. But this is the key thing. We may live a long, healthy life. And I think it's important for us to advocate that. And I think all of us want to be able to do that. We can certainly contribute more when we're healthy, both to our family as well as to society. But we will still die. Unless there's a meaningful intervention, and if I just focus on myself at the moment, I will cease to exist for eternity. Now, I don't want to sound morbid here, but I remember as a 4 or 5 year old, we were living in Lismore, and my parents were going along to a series that was put on by a local evangelist, and it was called Dead Men Do Tell Tales, and it was a fascinating thing. But for something that was going on in there, I had grasped onto this concept of eternity and being dead for eternity, and my little 4-year-old brain was desperately trying to work out what that actually meant, to be dead for eternity. I knew what it was like to be alive. I hadn't been alive very long, but I was trying to work out, what did that mean to be dead for eternity, never actually exist again? And while I haven't completely solved that question, I sit with it a little bit more comfortably now. And yes, as my wife says, you know, when you're dead, you won't even know that you're there for eternity. I said, yeah, but it's not the point when I'm dead. It's the point that now that I'm living and I recognize what I will lose to not exist for eternity. I mean, all of us have an incredible privilege to actually exist. And I believe that God wants every one of us to, in fact, exist for eternity. But it's important for us to get what that really means, because then it puts life into a little bit better perspective. Solomon says, for the living know that they will die, but the dead know nothing. They have no further reward, because the memory of them is forgotten. Their love, their hate, and their envy have already vanished, and they will never again have a share in all that is done under the sun. He goes on further in another passage. It is better to go to a house of mourning than to go to a house of feasting. For death is the destiny of every man or everyone, and the living should take this to heart. This is not a morbid comment. This is actually just a reality. And I think one of the things, as I mentioned earlier, that the COVID-19 pandemic, as it's labeled, has at least given people an opportunity to, I think, reflect a little bit more soberly. With a world that's so full of activity and so full of entertainment, it's something that people don't think about until it's often much too late. Whereas it is the destiny of every man, unless there is some sort of meaningful intervention. And this is where it comes. Since the children have flesh and blood, he, that is Christ, too shared in their humanity, so that by his death he might break the power of him who holds the power of death, that is, the devil, and free those who all their lives were held in slavery by their fear of death. And it is true, the world is actually in fear of death. There's a couple of things you can look at it. You can look at the panic in the pandemic, the ethical compromise in order to preserve life. You know, put me first at any cost, whether it's trying to drag toilet paper from somebody else. Now, I don't think that they necessarily thought that that was life and death, but at the same time, it is creating a panic that people are worried, I'm going to be somehow compromised. And then, of course, the one that I'm much more familiar with, people spending billions of dollars, and I feel sorry for them. There are people that would willingly give me money, and I have had 2 billionaires who wanted to actually invest in some of the stuff we were doing. Now, you might say that you could have just string them along for a little while, but I would unfortunately have to be part of selling what I would consider as snake oil. Now, if you allow me to sell it with its right kind of caveats, I have no problem. But I'm not going to be out there telling people that they will be living forever or even substantially longer than what I think we'll actually do. And people will spend billions, particularly as they get older and realize they're not really coming back from there. But God has given us a promise, and I'm going to finish with this. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whoever believes in him shall not perish, but have eternal life. And if there's anything that I would love just to encourage people to do at this stage, is just reflect on where life really is. All of us ultimately will die, except we take Christ. And I don't expect you to expect anybody to take Christ without investigating it, whether this is a hollow claim or whether it's an actual claim. But I really would encourage people to get to know Jesus. Truthfully, this is your only hope. Thank you.
Thank you, Ross. Would you like to close in prayer?
Yes, let's just bow our heads. Father in heaven, we just thank you for opportunity. We thank you for life, and we particularly just thank you for your death on the cross for us. And we thank you that it is through your gift that you can give us a hope at eternal life. The great gospel commission, Father, is to be able to show that and tell that and give other people that opportunity. And we just pray that you would give us the strength, and through your Holy Spirit enable us to do this now in Christ's name. Amen.